One. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Mindful Mornings podcast with Dr. Matt. I'm very excited today to have a special guest, colleague, as well as friend, and a Mets fan, Dr. Ann Metz of Southern New Hampshire University. Dr. Ann Metz LPC has been a therapist, educator, and researcher for more than a decade. Originally from a military family in Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, Dr. Metz graduated with honors from the University of Virginia as an Echols Scholar with a double major in philosophy and religious studies in 2003. After a stint as a fashion model in Italy and the Netherlands, she returned to the US to pursue a career in media and worked as a reporter for an alternative newsweekly in Charlottesville from 2005 to 2009. In 2010, Dr. Metz enrolled in the clinical mental health counseling program at James Madison University in Harrisonburg and earned her doctorate in counselor education and supervision in 2019. During her PhD program, she received a research fellowship to study criminal justice reform at the University of Virginia Law School. She also completed her clinical residency in emergency, inpatient, and outpatient settings. Dr. Metz has also completed training programs in Ketamine-Assisted Psychotherapy through Fluence and MDMA-Assisted Therapy through MAPS. Dr. Metz is licensed to practice counseling, psychotherapy, and supervision in several states, including New Mexico, Colorado, Virginia, California, and Oregon. In her free time, she enjoys skiing, ceramics, and hiking. You can follow her on Instagram at Dr. Metz or listen to her podcast, The Psychedelic Skeptic, whenever you get your podcasts. Dr. Metz, you are clearly a fascinating individual, much cooler life than I have ever lived. I'm impressed with everything that I'm reading here, in terms of the experience with law, modeling overseas, getting into the psychedelics and so on. What haven't you done throughout life?
Oh man, what haven't I done? Well, I haven't made a lot of money. How about that?
Yeah, yeah, right. And that sometimes comes with a part of the territory. We're giving people, helping professionals, right? So it's not about
Yeah.
the money; it's about the assistance we give others.
Yeah, and my friends who are in fact Mets fans would say that we would like to have another World Series in my lifetime. I think that would be another thing that we could add in there.
Be amazing. And hey, at least you're not a Chicago White Sox fan right now. We're doing very terribly. But hey, we got a few wins here in the past couple of weeks. So I'll go ahead and take those in stride. And yeah, I'm sorry with the goofy little questions. I can't help myself. I remember the first times we met, I'm like, so, Ann, are you a Mets fan? And you were.
Yeah, well, it's actually really funny. Over the years, I'm, in a serious relationship now, but, when I was dating, I would often attract Mets fans, and it was just this sort of like inevitable but tragic people that, it's like they like this team and they're terrible and they always lose. And so you'd be dating and the summer months would just be like brutal, like every game was awful. So, anyway, yeah, I have to just be careful about people's motivations for wanting to be in my life. If it's baseball related, it's usually a sign to kind of, you know, make for the door.
Steer clear, go the other direction. Well, it naturally worked out for me as well. It was about second grade that I found my favorite team, the Green Bay Packers. And hey,
Mm.
their logo is a big G. My last name is
Mhm.
Gloviak. Works out perfectly. So especially when my family's going about in the fall season, we all have our little G hats on. It works out perfectly. Now, fortunately, they're not a losing team. But we'll see how the
I
season
was
goes. I
gonna
know the
say.
Bears fans out here in Chicagoland are excited about Caleb Williams and everybody else they've got on their team now. So we're here to talk about psychedelics. So I'm interested. What are some of the origins with the psychedelics here? So I'm reading your history, and a lot of it didn't begin necessarily with with the psychology, with the psychedelics or anything. So how did you find this path?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was in college, I was pretty experimental and, tried my fair share of drugs, psychedelics included. And, I was like, oh, well, that was an interesting experience, not anything I really feel like I need to do again. And so I kind of didn't really think about it for another almost 20 years. And then around 2019, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, came out. And, at the time I was working in an outpatient capacity, seeing clients, and was just getting a little bit frustrating, feeling like there wasn't a great technology to support what we were trying to do with clients and counseling, that they would sort of hit a wall
Mhm.
and it was hard to get beyond that. And, I mean, I feel like there are really great reasons that was the case. But for me as a clinician, I just wanted a better way to help people. And so I read this book, and I think it was exciting on the one hand of like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? But it was also really interesting to hear about the history of psychedelics in the counseling and therapy field, that there was this long tradition of using them in the 50s, 60s, and 70s before they were rescheduled for therapeutic purposes. And so it was just really cool to hear about that, that I had always heard about Timothy Leary and, the electric Kool-Aid acid test and all of those things, but I didn't really know about the therapeutic usages, including, within AA. I mean, Bill Wilson was somebody who had his spiritual experience through the use of a psychedelic. He had took belladonna when he was in an inpatient unit and sort of described it as the transformational experience that allowed him to stay sober. And, kind of in the early days of AA, there was some talk even of including LSD as part of the AA treatment, which blew my mind. I mean, I had no idea that had happened.
That was buried pretty deep. Yes.
Yeah, it was buried pretty deep, and it also didn't get very far when he suggested it. I think the kind of elders of AA were like, yeah, we're not doing that. But it is kind of a cool point. And so that's kind of how I got started with it. And then, 2020 rolled around and the pandemic hit, and I started going to some psychedelic meetups that were through the Portland Psychedelic Society, and because of COVID, they would post them all, through YouTube, through Zoom. So in Virginia, I was able to participate in these conversations that I never would have had access to before. And along the way, came across an underground guide, you would say, who had been doing psychedelic work with people in Oregon for many, many years. And I really liked what she had to say. She was sort of, trauma focused and trauma informed, and also kind of had this interesting way of going about it, of using low doses while, having conversations with people within the therapeutic context. And so kind of emailed her and just asked if she had any apprentices, people that could get involved. And she wrote back and she was like, yes, in fact, I do. So that was kind of my first taste of it, a little bit of training. I'm pretty conservative about not wanting to break the law. I mean, my college drug years aside, but I have a clinical license. And so I was like, I want to learn more about this, but I don't really want to do this work. And so, up until I got involved with doing ketamine, that was kind of what my relationship was, just purely educational training, wasn't really doing practice. So so that's kind of the story.
Well, and thank you for sharing, your origins with that. And I remember being, the undergraduate, University of Illinois. I was there from 2001 to 2005. And you had a lot of binge drinking was a big thing at the time. You'd see a lot of cannabis throughout campus, but also, psilocybin in the form of magic mushrooms. And you had people on campus growing the mushroom kits, or, ketamine. I remember people like, yeah, here's this horse tranquilizer, that you could take. And yeah, K-hole experience is really cool. LSD at the time wasn't necessarily too popular. I can't say that I've ever met anybody on campus who's like, hey, here, you want to have blotter LSD or anything like that. But ketamine and psilocybin were the two big ones at the time while I was an undergraduate at campus. And I'm wondering, like, how do we go from, a recreational use of something like ketamine where people are getting into a K-hole versus finding a therapeutic means to be able to help somebody who is struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, somebody who's struggling with major depressive disorder, severe. Like, how do we go there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, I think the big difference to me, between maybe recreational use and intentional use for psychological purposes, for healing, for treatment, I think is just that. It's the idea that you're kind of using it intentionally to learn something about yourself or to heal in a certain way. And a big piece of that, of course, is the set and setting, which is a kind of concept that came to us from the psychedelic elders who were, pioneering psychedelic therapy. And when we say set, we mean mindset, like how someone is thinking about it. And again, that's where the intention comes in. Like, this isn't supposed to be about me having a good time or me having fun or me appreciating the music. It's about me going inward and understanding who I am and what my relationship to the universe is. And then the setting is, of course, a big piece of it. And so when we think about the setting, you're in an office, there is a clinical provider there. You've done a lot of preparation for the experience in advance so that you are, aware of some of the risks and how you really want to respond to any so difficult content that might come up. And so I think those two things are really what distinguishes recreational use from the kind of use that everyone is excited about now, and that we're looking at as being kind of a new paradigm for mental health treatment in the future.
I like that. So, when I oftentimes think about the recreational end of it here. So, as you're saying, the setting, if you will, the people who you're around, that was a big warning. It's like, okay, make sure you're around good friends, people who are going to support you. You feel very comfortable, have the right mindset going into it. You want to make sure that you realize that you are going to be under the influence of a drug, that this is going to have a significant impact. You're not going crazy. You'll eventually come down, but also wanting to make sure that you have a beautiful setting. So many people would do it in the forest or at some type of area where they're able to hike, walking around the campus, just some type of beautiful, serene type of setting around good friends, have a good mentality and then enjoy the trip. Whereas there are certainly things that could come up if you have the wrong mindset, you're in the wrong setting, you feel trapped into a tiny space, that's when you could really have that bad trip, which can feel like a nightmare. And as we know, when you're under the influence of psychedelics, kind of slows things down, so an hour feels like 3 hours feels like an entire day type of thing. That's why they call it the trip. And so I'm wondering here then, how does the office setting, work in a manner that can support a good type of feeling going through this, as opposed to somebody who was using recreationally, needed the good friends, needed the beautiful setting, and so on?
Yeah. Well, I think there actually hasn't been a whole lot of research done on therapy offices for CAP or for any sort of psychedelic treatment. But I think for me, what I try to create is a space where people have access to nature, that there's a comfortable place to lay down, really nice blankets, snacks at the end, that it's really it's really inviting and it's really warm and you feel almost like you're kind of at home. But of course, you're in this beautiful setting. For folks who are listening, I live outside of Taos, New Mexico, which is, in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which is the southern part of the Rockies. And sort of like out the window of my office is, you can see this incredible mountain. In the winter, it's snow-capped, and, in the summer, it's lush and green. And so I think all of those things are just a really important an important way of helping people to feel safe and to feel secure, because the safer and the more secure they feel, the more they can surrender to the experience and the easier it is to really, kind of move deeper into it and I think to get more out of it. But yeah, and certainly there are retreat centers that just do everything entirely in nature. For my podcast, I interviewed the CEO of Myco Meditations, which is a psilocybin retreat center in Jamaica, and all of their treatments are done outside in the shade, underneath trees, next to the ocean, which sounded like a really lovely setting, so I think it's important.
Absolutely. Well, we talk a lot in psychology about the mind, body, spirit connection. And I think the spiritual aspect of things is the one that's a little bit nebulous, ambiguous for a lot of people. Well, I'm not a religious person. Okay. So are you spiritual? I don't even know what that means or even where to start. So when we talk about spirituality, we really try to think of our connection to something higher, something bigger, being a part of the universe. And it almost seems to make sense to me that being in nature, which is part of the universe, the system, if you will, that would be a place that would facilitate some of the best spiritual awakenings, right? That just really makes sense.
Yeah, totally. One thing I really like from 12-step groups is the idea of, God is an acronym for the great outdoors.
Mhm. Essentially, yes. Well, and that's the thing too. When I'm speaking with clients, like, hey, I mean, your higher power can literally be
Mm,
whatever that is. Something that helps keeps you grounded, something that helps keep you motivated, something where you have some objectives throughout your life, and so on. And so, having that connection to the universe, and like realizing where everything connects, can really make a difference for individuals. Now, I found it pretty interesting in my work when I was in private practice, for about 7 years here. We used to cross refer with a psychiatrist who was pretty ahead of his time at the time. A neuropsychiatrist was doing different things with TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation, which was
mm,
fantastic. Hyperbaric chamber, so was
mm,
doing that. Some of the earlier ketamine type trials, here in the area. I was just really impressed with what was going on. With some of the clients who were referred on over to me, some had success with it, others not quite so much. And one of the worries that I did have with some of the clients, especially those who were struggling with addiction, was that they would go in, they would have a good treatment, but then come on out and sometimes want to still continue using. So,
mm.
like, what do you think is an appropriate way to facilitate this on a clinical type of level? Like, who do you see more so as an appropriate type of patient for this? What might treatment look like? Those types of
Mm.
questions.
Yeah, well, I think for particularly for people who have a history of substance use and are in recovery, I go about it really carefully. And, part of the process is a pretty extensive intake, and a lot of assessment around alcohol and drug use, both currently and also historically. In general, I would not work with somebody to do with CAP, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, with somebody who's newly in recovery.
Okay.
Occasionally I'll get, emails from family members that are like, oh, my son's getting out of rehab and I'd love him to go see you. And I'm like, nope, worst
We are so on
idea
the same
ever.
page. Good. Yes.
Yeah. And so, even people who have been in recovery for a longer period of time, I often try to make sure that they do just a couple of sessions with a medical prescriber. Obviously, I'm an LPC. I can't prescribe ketamine. And so, I just think just to see how people respond, how they react, how it impacts their recovery, doing it under medical supervision, either in a infusion clinic or in another office-based setting is just really important for that segment of the population. Because I do think um, the enthusiasm that people have for psychedelics as the solution to addiction, I think is maybe a little bit overblown. I mean, I think that it certainly can be helpful for people, but I also feel like it can be a real trigger and the start of return to use for folks. And so, I tend to be pretty cautious about folks who are in recovery, but I know there's a lot of desperation and there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. And states are putting a ton of money toward looking at ibogaine as a potential treatment for addiction. I think that a lot of what people are using the opioid settlement for is looking into this as a potential treatment. And, I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful. But, I think ketamine, because we know it is a drug of abuse that people certainly struggle with, that it's, something that needs to be managed carefully. I mean, I think the example of Matthew Perry is a great one. He was someone who was receiving ketamine infusions under a doctor's care for a while, and it went really, really well. And then, it, triggered a return to use where he was getting ketamine on the street. And that ultimately was, what was involved with his death over the summer. So, I think it's thorny.
No, it is. And I completely agree with you. And I've worked with many different clients in many different types of situations. And, and even something as simple. So, we're talking about psychedelics right now. My origins are in opiates and, worked with a lot of intravenous heroin use. And, I would have clients who were saying, okay, well, cannabis, I can get recreational medical, well, some of them recreationally, but, medicinal cannabis. How about I use that instead of, to come off of heroin? in and that's going to help me out. It's a lot better. I'm comparing an apple to an orange. But then the problem with what I would see there is even with cannabis, you're getting these vape pens, they have a 98% potency in them. You're smoking morning, noon, and nights. You're constantly high. It's almost as though you traded one addiction for the other. And while, okay, admittedly, cannabis is safer than opioids to a great extent. However, still, you're compromising other factors in life and you're not living a life in which you're able to think clear-mindedly. You're not able to function in society the way that you ideally want to and what you're trying to strive to. So I think sometimes people get so excited that I can switch from one drug to another and I'm going to be in this better place. No, the mechanism of addiction is still there. Even if you're switching from one substance to the other, and you're reading through the lines of what you were sharing and why we're exactly on the same page here is that, it's not the immediate miracle cure. It's not like, okay, you're struggling with addiction, here's a ketamine trial, and then all of a sudden, boom, the addiction is gone. We have to carefully monitor it. You still need to go through the psychotherapy. You do need to work on lifestyle changes. We do need to integrate self-care and all these other factors. And in addiction, we always say change your persons, places, and things. So if you are going to be using something like this, it's very important that you don't have access to recreational black market ketamine or mushrooms or anything along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, I think harm reduction is a really important principle for us to be working with as clinicians, particularly if someone's goal is not sobriety. If that's not what their goal is, then I do think, something that is less risky, a cannabis pen is way better than something that might be laced with fentanyl. But you're right. I mean, I do think for somebody who's had a period of sobriety and abstinence, that suddenly like, okay, adding in ketamine, you have to really kind of do that mindfully and carefully to make sure that this is going to be a helpful tool. Because honestly, the experience of ketamine, it's pleasurable. You are like kind of shot out into the universe. And, I think for a lot of people who struggle with drug addiction, it's going to be a really familiar feeling. And, that's sometimes not that helpful.
Oh, absolutely. And, I like how you mentioned harm reduction right there. And going back to the cannabis example where I'd have clients trying to switch from opioids, to cannabis. And like I said, some of them, they'd smoke the high potency morning, noon, and nights. They're still kind of living essentially a similar type of life that they were before, less risk. So, in those types of cases too, it was important to have that harm reduction plan. Okay, instead of the 98% potency pen, how about you smoke the flower that's at 19%? So like this way, you're getting, a fraction of the amount of, the THC that you were going to be getting from this pen and can function a lot better. Or how about instead of doing it the first thing in the morning, wait until you're done with work, do it at night. Let's try to put some space in there and almost have like this schedule in which that they were going to do that and continue tapering off from that, or like similar type of thing I would do from binge drinking and so on. I'm wondering, how could you do titrate off or do a harm reduction approach, let's say for somebody who is already struggling with ketamine use, so they're coming in wanting to wean off the psychedelic, like what would we recommend for something like that?
Well, I think that somebody who has a ketamine addiction and is already struggling, I'm sure that there are providers somewhere that would treat that person and offer that person that, but I certainly would not recommend it. I mean,
It's not that
maybe
common that you see that one
yeah.
either, but
Yeah, I would sort of say, how about a detox center, or we try some inpatient therapy there. So yeah, I would just sort of say that if you have any history of abuse of ketamine, then it's just not a good treatment to consider.
so we want to consider something else there and make sure we're not using the same thing to be able to titrate down off of that. I'm
Yeah.
wondering, how about in terms of like future considerations? Like, where do you see psychedelics going moving forward? So we've broken a lot of ground. It's a conversation we're having. For years now, I've been seeing different articles on the topic, even in my role of writing with Choosing Therapy, some of the media entries. I've written different topics on it, and it's really gaining some traction here. As you said, we see more, places throughout the world that are opening up, different types of clinics. Some are more in an office setting, some are more outdoors, some are in a forest, some are on a beach. So we're gaining a lot of traction here. Where are we going to go?
Well, I think there are kind of three directions that we're going to go. The first direction is the medicalized route, which is FDA approval of, psychedelic assisted therapies. So it isn't going to be that the psychedelic itself is going to be FDA approved. It's always going to be, a conjoint treatment with the therapy. So right now, the FDA is considering MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD as an approved treatment process for PTSD. And that is likely to be decided upon by August of this year. So we're probably going to know pretty soon. If you had asked me maybe like a month ago if I thought it was going to go through, I was like, yeah, definitely. But there has been considerable pushback, with regard to the clinical trials and the data and the suppression of adverse experiences during the clinical trials. And so I'm not entirely sure that it's going to get approved in August. I mean, I hope it does, because I think it could be a really important and powerful treatment for folks. And I also think the level of scrutiny that has been sort of put on psychedelics is so much greater than anyone ever put on with regard to, an SSRI approval. If the standard that folks who were involved in the MDMA trials, if those standards of care were being applied, like the STAR-D would never have happened. And we probably wouldn't have, half of the psychotropic medications that we have. It's really been a lot of scrutiny, which I get. It's totally new. FDA has never approved a therapy before. So that's medicalization. Psilocybin is also kind of in phase 3 clinical trials for treatment-resistant depression. So I imagine that that's probably going to be in a similar position in another year and a half. And then the sort of second, pathway forward for psychedelics would be the community use model, which is sort of what's going on right now in Oregon, what's soon to be happening in Colorado, and I suspect California and Massachusetts are not too far behind. And that's the idea that the state sets up a system for regulation of facilitated experiences. So they, license facilitators, they license treatment centers, they license manufacturers. And so people, participate, but it's a closed system. So it's not like recreational cannabis where you're going to be able to go to the store and buy mushrooms and take them at home. You're going to have to do it within the system, by providers who have been sort of sanctioned by the state. So that's the second one. That is happening already. It's pretty messy. I just interviewed somebody who is a facilitator in Oregon last week, and it just sounds messy, and it sounds very expensive and quite problematic. So I don't know, we'll see. And then the third route would be sort of decriminalization or maybe psychedelic churches. That's, I think, the kind of third avenue for people to see like psychedelics cropping up in the future. And that's a kind of really wild area that, essentially because of, the Constitution and the separation of church and state, if you establish yourself as a church, then the federal government has to stay out of it, even if part of your sacraments are using Schedule I drugs. So that's kind of where I see the future. I think everyone's really excited about it and we're really optimistic, but I think we need to really temper our expectations in terms of outcomes, in terms of accessibility, as we go forward. But, it's also a promising, exciting time. So.
And we do have to, absolutely. We do have to consider that it is going to take some time. There needs to be some regulation. Also, there's going to be, the whole political, bureaucratic, type of stuff on top of it. How do we tax these drugs? Like all that type of stuff is going to feed into it here as well. But it seems as though there is a lot of hope. There is a lot of promise. But again, just really trying to figure out the exact mechanism to which that's going to work. Because we know everybody's physiology is different. Everybody's situation is different. The way that they respond to different drugs is going to be different. different. So this is by no means whatsoever a one size fits all approach. But at the same time, as you were saying a moment ago, and that's a big one too. You can see many specials on TV, many articles you can read, about some of these churches with the separation of church and state. Oh, well, it's part of our spiritual ritual. We do this for religious purposes. And then people are using them, and some of which are people who shouldn't be using them and find themselves at even bigger problems. So I'm wondering too, as we're talking about the future, and you shared your story in terms of how you got involved, and a really great story as to how it all came to be. Yeah, you're looking for an apprentice. Yeah, sure, here. And it all just naturally came together, through all the pandemic. I'm wondering, how might somebody else get involved? And I know there's, a lot of great resources out there. Psychedelic Skeptic, your podcast, is a really great opportunity to learn a lot more, hear from some of the other leading providers and thought leaders here throughout the country. But how might one take some action steps to actually get involved if they're interested in this field?
Yeah, well, I'm imagining that your audience is probably a mix of, regular folks and also probably people who are counselors or maybe some counseling students. And so, I think if you are interested in being a treatment provider, I would say a really great way to go about that is to look for a training program. There has been a real boom in psychedelic therapy training programs. Last count, there was about 150 of them. So, I would maybe encourage people to find one that is reputable, find one that is run by people who've actually done this work, who've been involved in clinical trials, and to make sure that any training program that you go through actually qualifies you to provide a service. There are a lot of them out there right now that are very expensive and very well regarded, but they don't actually qualify you to do anything. So make sure that it will be a good return on your investment. And for folks who are just kind of interested in what's happening, there are a few Substacks and mailing lists that I really like to be on. One is called the Microdose, which is a biweekly newsletter that the UC Berkeley puts out. They have a psychedelic center there. And that's a really well done one. It kind of covers lots of news, but it also does sort of interviews with people who are involved in the field, attorneys, people who are involved in the insurance business, researchers. So I really, really like that one as well. And then I would say, advocacy groups, here in New Mexico, there is a advocacy group that's trying to get the state legislature to pass something similar to what they have in Colorado and in Oregon, the kind of community-based use where we're able to set up service centers for providers to provide this service without having to go through the medical model. And so for me, getting involved with that and trying to help advocate for change has been important. And part of that, I think, is decriminalization of some of these substances. And then lastly, I would say another way to get involved is just any kind of community meetup, psychedelic societies. They're all over the place. You just have to Google them. So those are my suggestions that I usually give people. And of course, yes, listen to my podcast. Although I will admit that I provide a somewhat critical perspective on the whole field. I think that's just a very important point. And I'm an academic and I'm a researcher. And so, it's really important for me to make sure that we know the things that we know and that we can actually say the things that we're saying. And so that's kind of maybe my angle on it, is maybe a slightly more, a slightly more critical lens to what's happening in the field.
Well, and that's exactly what we need, because, a lot of people don't critically think through what it is that they're doing, what it is that they're putting in their body. And we have to keep in mind with something like psychedelics, I mean, other drugs as well. And these have a substantial impact on one's physiology, and they greatly influence your thoughts, your feelings, your behavior, so on and so forth, as we know. So it's important you don't just take somebody's word for it without looking deeper into it. And we know with these drugs, I mean, the slightest difference in the dose can make all the difference. One can be, therapeutic. The other one could lead to somebody tripping. People can get to overdose points and so on. So you have to make sure that people are in a good space with this. And as you said, there could be a lot of fraud out there. people who are, misrepresenting themselves, misrepresenting, what they're offering you and so on. And you really do have to be careful. And again, there's more that goes into it than, okay, I'm struggling with addiction, I'm struggling with depression, I'm struggling with PTSD. I'm going to do this treatment once, boom, I'm cured. There's more that goes into it. So that's another thing that I think is very important for people to realize, is that you still have to do the work. And that's one of the problems that people have in life. And, people want to get fixed quickly, and can certainly understand that. We all deal with different challenges in life. We want to feel good. That's the way that we're, wired in life, but you have to realize that you still do need to do the work regardless. So you have to do the work during and after treatment. And you also need to do the work before it to make sure that what you're getting yourself into is appropriate. And also want to make sure you have an appropriate assessment for fit for that type of treatment. Because again, it's going to be very different. Well, I know here we're getting toward the end of our time together, and I've really appreciated this conversation. You've been absolutely wonderful, Dr. Metz. I'm wondering, do you have any concluding thoughts, anything you would like to share in wrapping up for our viewers?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to recognize that there has been a massive investment by parties that have not, up until now, really been involved in the mental health care space. So a lot of investment from venture capital, from Silicon Valley. And I think that, for folks who have worked in mental health, can feel a little bit unnerving. And so I would just encourage anybody who's listening to really take a look at who they're really dealing with, and are they someone that they feel they can trust and put their well-being in their hands, or is it somebody who's really looking to make a profit and looking to, kind of exploit what they're seeing as a new market that's been created? I've just seen a lot of that. And, my hope is that over time, the businesses that are less ethical and less principled will sort of, be shaken out the door, or, get swept out. But I think right now we're kind of in a moment where there's maximum saturation of people who maybe have, have profit motive at the front of their mind. So I would just encourage people to be really mindful and critical about who they're working with.
Yeah, and even the legitimate variations of this treatment, they're expensive. It's a pricey type of treatment. And, especially when you have somebody who's price gouging, looking at the profit, don't really care about you. And people can wipe out their entire bank accounts, go into debt, thinking that they're getting something that's helping them. And as a matter of fact, it's really not helping. You're not doing the other work. And guess what? Now you're in debt, which makes the situation even worse here altogether. But, really great conversation. I'm wondering, what is the best way to be able to get a hold of you?
Yeah, well, feel free to email me. My email's easy. It's Anne, A-N-N-E, at Anne Metz, A-N-N-E-M-E-T-Z, slightly different than the baseball team.com. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Dr. Metz. Listen to my podcast, The Psychedelic Skeptic, wherever you like to get your podcasts. So thanks. This has been
Excellent.
great, Matt.
Well, thank you, Ed. You were absolutely wonderful guest. This is a very fun discussion, important discussion, and I look forward to future conversations here as we continue moving along. And I encourage everybody who's listening to this right now to check out the Psychedelic Skeptic. Really great information, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.